Well, I welcome this opportunity to discuss with you some aspects of development strategies, especially in the context of the deep uncertainties and the grave inequalities that countries all over the world are facing today in the pandemic and that they will face in the coming years as we recover from the global pandemic. There are deep uncertainties about the shocks that we are likely to face. There are deep uncertainties about the impacts of those shocks on our economy. And finally, there are deep uncertainties about the responses of the economy to the policies that we undertake. These uncertainties should give us a great deal of humility about economic policy. For decades, neoliberalism ignored these uncertainties. It pushed with confidence a set of policies that, by and large, did not work. And yet, repeatedly, the policies of the Washington Consensus or one form or another of neoliberalism, forms they had in Europe, pretended as if there were no uncertainties, that one could get away with simplistic rules. In Europe, they had simplistic rules like deficits should not be greater than 3% of GDP. Debt should not be greater than 60% of GDP. No regard to the uncertainties about the interest rates, the growth in population, the growth in productivity. It was, you might say, an arrogance about that they really understood the nature of the economy and our society. The irony, of course, was that those set of doctrines of neoliberalism were deeply, deeply flawed. And the result, of course, is that those policies did not work. We faced a series of crises that have shown that that model is wrong and that economic policy based on that models has been misguided. And now we are in a situation where we are confronting the reality we have to reform not only the policies, but the framework within which we make those policies. Two of the examples of the deep uncertainties that were not anticipated by the models were the pandemic through which we are going now, and the 2008 financial crisis. Neoliberalism had argued that deregulation and financial liberalization would unleash unprecedented economic growth. It didn't do that. What it did unleash was unprecedented economic instability. The models which underlay neoliberalism were equilibrium models that says so somehow the economy was always on an equilibrium trajectory, in spite of the fact that over and over again, there have been crises like the 2008 crisis, events like the pandemic that are hard and were not anticipated. We're now going through another potential crisis, the climate crisis. That crisis highlights the need for government action. It highlights the importance of externalities, where the actions taken by individuals and firms has enormous consequences on those all over the world. It highlights the need for global cooperation. There are still other crises that we are confronting all over the world. One of them that I've been concerned with a great deal is the inequality crisis. The pandemic has further revealed the depths of the inequalities, both within countries and between countries, and has exacerbated those inequalities. The virus is not an equal opportunity virus. It goes after those with poor health, which are disproportionately those with poor income. And that's especially true in those societies where There is not universal access to healthcare, and in which there is deficient systems of social protection. One of the reasons why the United States has been so ravaged by this disease, having about a quarter of the cases, in spite of the fact we have only about 4% of the population. The reason we've been so ravaged, in part, is that we have such poor social insurance system, social protection. We don't recognize in the United States, only advanced countries that doesn't recognize the right of access to healthcare as a basic human right. And the result of that is huge disparities between the health status of those at the bottom and that at the top. And overall, the system is working so poorly that life expectancy today is lower than it was when President Trump became the president, in spite of all the advances in science and medicine that have occurred in the interim. We also face a geopolitical crisis. There's a growth of authoritarianism. The US has been walking away from their international rule of law. There is a potential of a new Cold War. And I'll come back to these issues towards the end. The key lesson from these crises is that problems can't be solved by markets alone. We need to work together, what economists call collective action. The pandemic has shown the consequences of 40 years of neoliberalism, 40 years of denigrating the importance of government, the importance of collective action. The result of that 40 years of denigrating the role of government is that government was less prepared to deal with the pandemic, less prepared to deal with the other crises that I talked about a minute ago. Government was weakened. We all turned to the government in the event of this pandemic, as we did in the event of the global financial crisis. Government in the United States was not able to respond in an effective way. But the irony was that neither were markets able to respond. That at the same time that neoliberalism was talking about markets and weakening governments, it actually was weakening the markets themselves. Because the kinds of rules that were put into place in this era of neoliberalism resulted in markets that were short-sighted, short-term. We saw that in 2008, where the financial institutions looked to how they can make returns in the short run, even when it engaged in excessive risk-taking, as it engaged in predatory lending, market manipulation, a host of harms to our society. But this pandemic has again shown that markets have not worked well. We've been astounded in the United States that our markets could not even produce simple products like protective gear or masks, let alone more complicated products like tests or ventilators. In a way, we created cars without spare tires. We saved a little bit of money in the short run, but of course, we all know what happens when you have a flat tire. We are some distance from the nearest gas station. The cost can be enormous. We save a little bit of money up front, but we pay a big price down the line. And that is the nature of markets when you don't have good corporate governance laws. And unfortunately, neoliberalism restructured the rules of the market economy that had the consequence that not only government became less effective, but so did markets. The pandemic has highlighted a whole series of issues. In a way, it was a natural experiment. It affected many countries, or most countries around the world. But different countries responded differently. And so we could see by looking at the successes and failures what contributed to those successes and those failures. Economists, social scientists, epidemiologists will be studying this natural experiment, I think, for decades to come. But we've seen enormous successes. Countries like New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, poor countries like Vietnam, doing a tremendous job in getting the disease under control. And then we've seen other countries that are total disaster, like the United States and Brazil. And so it is natural for us to ask, what is it that makes for success? Countries that have done well are countries not just with effective governments, with strong institutions and good science. But one thing I want to emphasize is the role of trust. Trust of citizens, of government, and of each other. High levels of inequality undermine trust. Undemocratic governments undermine trust. And one of the reasons that the United States has become such a polarized society is, I believe, it's because of our high level of inequality, the highest level of inequality among the advanced countries. I chaired an international commission on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, and then subsequent to that, an expert group at the OECD on the same subject. In our last report in 2018, a little more than a year ago, we emphasized the importance of trust. We also emphasize the importance of developing a series of metrics to assess this. But as we think more broadly about our frameworks of development and responding to crises, we have to go beyond GDP. It's not a good measure of economic performance, not a good measure of well-being, of development, of social progress. In our work, we call for a dashboard of indicators, incorporating, for instance, sustainability, concerns about inequalities, metrics of health. As we confront this crisis, as happened in 2008, this is important, and especially concerns about inequality. One of the things that happened in 2009 to 2012, in the period of recovery, was that 91% of the increase in GDP in the first 3 years of the so-called recovery went to the top 1%. The consequence was that for most of Americans, there was no recovery. And so as the president and the head of the Federal Reserve talked about a recovery, many citizens thought something is amiss. Lack of trust in government. They thought that statistics were being manipulated. Government was not working for ordinary citizens. What they were calling recovery was a recovery for the bankers, the very people who had caused the crisis, but not a recovery for ordinary Americans who were losing their homes by the millions, losing their jobs by the millions. This problem is even greater today. We talk today very explicitly about a K-shaped recovery. And what that means is that the pandemic has not only so much adversely affected those at the bottom compared to the top. The people at the top are continuing with their jobs, zooming around the world. The people at the bottom are experiencing a much higher death rate, a much higher exposure to the disease itself, and a much higher loss of income. And then they're not recovering as well. And there are long-term concerns about the education of their children, where they find it much more difficult to engage in Zoom education. One aspect that is not reflected well in GDP, besides inequality and sustainability that I've just talked about, is the sense of insecurity. Security is very important for well-being and for development. Individuals can't really focus on what is needed for their long-term well-being if they are confronted with high levels of insecurity. Markets don't provide good insurance for big risks. That's one of the reasons why it's so important to have good systems of social insurance. We need to have collective action in these arenas. The deep uncertainties to which I've been referring are also forcing us to rethink some of the old rules that guided economic policy. I mentioned earlier Europe's strictures about not having deficits greater than 3% of GDP, a number that was pulled out of thin air. But there are other numbers equally arbitrary, equally dangerous if they're to be pursued with rigor. And the deep uncertainty shows precisely that danger. Rules like you can't have inflation greater than 2% or debts greater than 60% of GDP. These rules never made any sense. We need to today look for better budgetary frameworks, better frameworks for thinking about monetary policy. We need, for instance, more reliance on automatic stabilizers, more automatic adjustments of programs reflect their underlying objectives, expanding with key drivers like the number of beneficiaries, leaving space for more thoughtful discretionary policies to respond to the deep uncertainties as they get revealed, and they will get. We will be over and over again facing these deep uncertainties. All the lessons I've talked about, the balance between the market and state, strengthening both, the importance of science, social insurance, trust, equality, new budgetary frameworks, represent in some way, the upside to these crises and the deep uncertainty that we faced. We finally confronted the deficiencies of neoliberalism, the deficiencies in the arbitrary rules that have guided policies in the past. And that provides the opportunity for us to rethink the way forward for development, the way forward for running economic policy in countries all over the world. In 2008, the chief of staff of President Obama, Rahm Emanuel, said, "We should never let a crisis go to waste." Unfortunately, the US did precisely that. Indeed, the mismanagement of that crisis led to a political dynamic that has been playing out with an extraordinary ugliness in the United States. We shouldn't let this happen a second time. I'm optimistic about where we are today. As I've talked to people all over the world, there is finally a sense of a realization of the flaws of the old models, the deep uncertainties that we face, and the necessity of developing frameworks to deal with these deep uncertainties. One example of that optimism is what is happening in the United States under the leadership of our president-elect, Joe Biden. What's happening in Europe? A refrain that I hear over and over again is build back better. We don't want to go back to where we were in January 2020. We should have realized that that world was marked by high levels of inequalities. It was not environmentally sustainable, not economically sustainable. We had an economy that was not resilient. We had a government that was not prepared to deal with the kinds of emergencies, crises that we were going to face. And so there is this refrain, build back better. Build back an economy and a society which is greener, more knowledge-based, greater equality. We have to make our money do double, triple duty. The money that we're spending to help recover the economy from this very deep downturn has to, at the same time, lead to a restructuring of our economy and our society to confront the other crises that we face, the crises of climate, inequality, and restructure our society to a more knowledge-based world. Finally, I can't help but note that the assault on democracy, human rights, basic values that has been going on, especially in the last 4 years by Trump, aided and abetted by his party and by corporate leaders who thought they could use him to get the things they wanted. What they wanted was tax cuts for the rich, tax cuts for corporations, deregulation to allow them to spoil our environment, to take advantage of the poor and the more vulnerable. They thought they could use Trump to get what they wanted and at the same time keep his authoritarian and anti-democratic tendencies under tow. It's proven much harder than they thought. So as we've wound up in a country, and I'd say in a world, much more divided than we were. The unholy alliance has placed our democracy and our institutions at risk. It appears that they prove strong, our institutions, our democratic commitments have proven strong enough to survive, but just barely. We have looked at the abyss, and it is truly frightening. More frightening in many ways than COVID-19, which through science we have quickly brought under control. Bringing these tendencies to authoritarianism under control is going to be much more of a challenge. Having recognized the fragility of our democratic institutions in the United States and around the world, we must now turn to the hard work of reinforcing our democratic institutions, recommitting ourselves to democracy and human rights, and restructuring our economies and our societies to ensure inclusive and sustainable growth, to ensuring a shared prosperity for all. Thank you very much.